out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating as we venture back into the realm of international football once again. World Cup may be over, but we can still talk about all this stuff. Why not? On episodes before the recent World Cup, we talked a fair bit about England during the Ron Greenwood and Bobby Robson years, with the World Cups of 82, 86 and 1990. So that naturally leads us into what we're going to talk about tonight, whose reign we are going to be discussing. We're venturing into the early 90s and the Graham Taylor years, possibly not the most glittering of eras for England. With me for this one, we've got Carlton Palmer on Andy Sinton and Keith Curl. Magnificent. Sorry. No, my mistake. No. We've actually got better than that, thankfully. So with us muttering, "Do I not like that?" quietly in the corner is Chris Lepkowski. Hiya, Chris.
Hi, good to be on board. Thank you all.
So next up then, yelling, "Hit Les," all the way from down under is Joe Byatt. Hiya, Joe. Morning to you, well, it's evening for us.
Hello, everybody. How are you?
Very good. In a better state than Graham Taylor's England. And making up the quartet, we've got someone asking, can we not knock it? Michael Hamlen is with us of the 80s and 90s popular feed. How are you doing, Michael?
Yeah, not bad. Got to go big. So tonight. So yeah, should be a good one. I'm really looking forward to this. Good.
Well, we say looking forward. When Graham Taylor came into the job, England were full of optimism, weren't they? We'd had Italia 90 and the heady glow of Nessun Dorma and all of that we talked about on our last England World Cup related pod. But Bobby Robson was off to PSV Eindhoven and we had the appointment of Graham Taylor, fresh from leading Aston Villa to second place in the league the previous season. He'd had achievements with Watford, obviously, before that. So with that achievement, I guess, at Villa, Chris, come to you first, and beforehand with Watford, was he the obvious candidate at the time? It's easy to look with hindsight and think, well, this didn't go well. But at the time, was he the most obvious candidate? I don't think there was really a wealth of alternatives. And he'd done very well with Villa, hadn't he? But perhaps equally, though, it was a case of just picking the highest placed English manager in the league.
Yeah, that's how it felt, wasn't it? I mean, if you think about the managers who were English and available, Howard Kendall had been to Athletic Bilbao and was back in England at Man City. Terry Venables had come back from Barcelona and was at Tottenham, and he never really felt like an FA appointment, as we would subsequently find out. And then you've got people like Howard Wilkinson, Ron Atkinson, two respected managers who are both knocking around, certainly in Ron Atkinson's case, in the second division with Sheffield Wednesday. Howard Wilkinson's rebuilding Leeds. And we're a couple of years off from Trevor Francis and Jerry Francis emerging into that kind of territory. So the only other candidates were all Scottish. You know, George Graham, Alex Ferguson, Kenny Dalglish. They're not going to get the England job. And I think
you can't have a foreigner managing England, can you? That would never happen.
Absolutely, no. And Graham Taylor had done such a really good job at Watford. He'd taken a team from the fourth division and done a great job then. And one thing he did, which I think, I'm not going to be particularly praiseworthy of Graham Taylor throughout this pod for all sorts of reasons, but there's so much respect, I think, owed to him for leaving Watford, a top flight club, and taking a step back into what we now call the Championship to manage Villa in the second tier, and effectively starting again and taking a Villa team from relegation and leading them not only back into the top flight, but leading them back into second. And I think really at this point in 1990, he's done such a good job at Watford, and he's taken Villa to second, and he does feel like the only candidate. And actually, when you go back through the archives, it was a decision, I think, that was made quite early into that sort of spring and summer, it was as soon as Bobby Robson announced that he would not be staying on, it was fairly clear that Taylor would be the next cab off the rank.
So with everything Chris has said there, Joe, coming to you next. Graham Taylor, yes, he'd been very successful with Watford, very successful with Aston Villa, but the style, this is something that hounded him throughout his career, of course. The style that he'd achieved it all in wasn't Liverpool, was it? It wasn't slick, it wasn't aesthetically beautiful. It was effective at club level, without question. But was his tactical approach always... Was it an open criticism, I suppose, that just left lingering there, that was always going to be a stick to beat him with if things didn't go well? And was he always going to be up against it from the start because of that?
Yes, that's precisely one of the problems. I always wonder if when things started to go wrong, and it's easy to forget now that initially, for the first few months, things were going quite well with him. And it was, he took over, and there's always the intrigue about John Barnes. John Barnes' performances picked up a bit, and that was largely put down to him. So things did seem to be improving. But when things were going wrong, I think part of him would have loved to go back to what he knew and go route one, Como, long ball. But he knew he would have been hammered for it. And if he didn't want to do that, why did he leave out some of the players he left out who would have provided balance to the good, solid, hard-working professionals we had in the England team at that point,
Exactly. I think you're probably right that he was sort of falling back on what he knew, and he couldn't handle the flair. And he'd had John Barnes, of course, at Watford, hadn't he? But Barnes had gone on several notches since then. I guess. But it's not as if he hadn't had flair players, but maybe in a more restrictive way. Equally, I guess, Bobby Robson restricted some of his flair too, Michael, didn't he? Following on from 1990, I guess one aspect to say from following 1990 is it's a bit of a poison chalice of England suddenly coming up to a semi-final from apparently a lower ebb. But equally, I don't know, what do you think though? Is it a hiding to nothing, Michael? What's your view?
It's a really difficult one because you say he's almost like the worst time to take a job is when that club's or the country in this case has done really, really well in semi-finals, and you've got to take it on. And of course, you've lost, in this case, you lost Shilton, which is not the end of the world, but you've got Butcher's obviously gone, Brian Robson's coming to the end, Gary Lineker's, 30 odd. So I think as Chris said previously in the previous pod in the 1991, you're losing your spine of your teams. You've got to find replacements. So I think to a degree, he always was going to have a bit of a challenge on his hands because, yes, the expectation, the Gazamania has just gone through the roof. And, of course, you're expecting now to qualify for Euro 92 quite comfortably and probably progress into Euro 92 and win it, which is always going to be difficult to win a tournament. Of course it is. But, he's definitely got I wouldn't say he's got his hand tied behind his back, but he's definitely got a lot of internal challenges upon his hands.
And I think, and you mentioned some of the players, we'll come on to them in a sec, but before we do that, were the press against him from the start as well? I know we talked a bit about general mood. I mean, Chris, you might have some knowledge and insight of this side of things. We mentioned there the poison chalice, what had gone before him. It's never going to be an easy act to follow. I mean, that's a thing that's echoed through the years in many a case. But you've also got someone with that tactical approach we talked about, but equally someone who's never actually won a major trophy as a manager. And obviously his playing career wasn't that stellar, and he certainly never played for England, which made him quite unusual, I suppose, for a pick. So did that put the press against him as well, which leaves you again on a hiding to nothing?
The first thing about Graham Taylor, he knew the press. His dad had been a journalist up in the north, I think in Grimsby. So Graham Taylor had an insight into what the media was like. And of course, he'd been managing Watford with Elton John as a chairman. That can't be an easy gig, no matter how successful you are. You've got that backdrop of an A-list celebrity sort of hanging around and being there, being around you. Looking back at the press coverage at the time, it was fairly supportive. There was a kind of, you have to look at it in the context. England had done really well. And I think a lot of people had a connection with this team. And I think the press had realised that they needed to connect with this team because they'd been stuck out in Italy, not appreciating just how loved that 1990 side was, while they were stuck out in World Cup camp, while the rest of us at home were celebrating and getting excited. So the press were very much on board when Taylor took charge, with one or two exceptions. Brian Glanville, the late great Brian Glanville, was utterly scathing, as you might expect from somebody who looks at things with a more critical eye than maybe some of the tabloid journalists did. And he was particularly scathing about this want to appoint a guy who was very much from the Charles Reap sort of manual of football management. And I'll come on to a few things further down the line, but such was Taylor's paranoia, and it became a paranoia because when he was appointed, it wasn't quite there, but it got worse and worse and worse. And we talk about the senior players that you mentioned, Shilton, Butcher, Lineker, Robson being the four. Only two of those retired, Shilton and Butcher. Robson in 91 was playing some of the best football that he had for many years, and in United's European Cup Winners' Cup run, and he actually says on the record that performance against Barcelona was one of his best for United. Gary Lineker was still firing. He was only in his early 30s. But Taylor had this paranoia of seniority. He had the paranoia of people who he felt would undermine him. And we see things unravel very, very quickly with the removal of the Waddle and the Beardsley duo, who were so important, so creative, so senior, but also were very key to Gaz's well-being. Paul Gascoinge being obviously a Geordie as they were. They kind of, he bounced off them and he needed them. Brian Robson was another key figure within that chemistry, within that dynamic. Gary Lineker was a roommate of David Platt's. Again, there was this paranoia that Taylor had about Lineker. And to return to your original question about the press, it would be post-1992 and he'd had that run, and we will go on to 92, but Taylor ended up effectively appointing his own spin doctor who would be advising him how to approach the press, to maybe sing a song or tell some jokes or to set an alarm clock jokingly so he could say, you only got this amount of time to ask me questions. He was already thinking and paranoid about the way the media were thinking about him. And this is going to be a strand that I think we're going to revisit during this chat, is a guy who was very parochial, very, very much from the provincial aspect of football, parachuted into the top job and really struggling to cope with it, really struggling to adapt to it, and feeling that pressure from day one in many respects.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I guess, Michael and Chris, you both touched on some of the players leaving the setup. There's a lot of experience there. Was he then a little unfortunate that he had those? There were various injuries. I know we're a year or so away from Gascoigne's first injury, but I don't think his fitness was quite there. I want to come on to Gascoigne in a little more detail in a sec. But Joe, do you think initially inheriting a squad possibly a bit in transition? The two big stars of Italia 90 were, for England anyway, I guess, were Gascoigne and Platt. We mentioned in the 1990 pod that it's perhaps surprising to people in 1990 that it was Platt that went on to become the linchpin of the England team, especially through the Taylor years. He was by far the most important player for Graham Taylor's England, whereas Gascoigne very much wasn't for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
But equally beyond that, a lot of experience has gone. So he's inheriting a squad in a bit of transition. So we'll get onto some of his selections and things like that as well, obviously. But again, it's a tough situation.
It was in transition, but that shouldn't be a problem to a manager. That's part of a manager's job. Players come and go all the time at all sorts of levels for all sorts of reasons. That shouldn't have been a problem to him, because that he would have known the ages of these players, and you often want a base of your own people, but at the same time, dealing with senior players, that's part of the job, and especially at that level, that's what you're going to be dealing with. What you'd like to think are the 15, 20 best English footballers. There is going to be some ego involved. There is going to be a bit of friction, but you deal with it. That's part of a job. It shouldn't have been a problem. It became a problem because he made it one. In that respect, he didn't handle the size of the job very well at all.
Well, yes. I mean, there's probably a number of examples of where it was too big for him. Some of which very much revealed in documentaries that we will get onto, absolutely. Now, we've all mentioned Chris Waddle and some of the others who weren't selected, Michael. I think though Chris Waddle is the one who sticks, well, to my mind anyway, the most, because this is an era where he was stunningly good for Marseille, getting to European Cup finals, excelling in a sort of freer forward role than he'd ever really enjoyed for England. I think it's probably true. But his ability was going up to another level at this point. The influence he was able to exert on one of Europe's best teams at the time. And yet, for whatever reason, Graham Taylor didn't want him in his team. I still don't understand it 35 years on. Michael, what do you think?
No, I'm with you 100%. I still don't understand why he disregarded him as soon as he did. I think he still plays in and out for about a year. I think his last game is the Poland one in qualification in the end of 91, I think. Or no, beginning of 91. Or is it against Turkey? It's one of those games where, he plays a game and then it's his last game. Funny enough, it's the same game he plays. It's Robson's last game as well. But I 100% agree. That Marseille team, for a start, that's a fantastic side. But he was basically given a free role. Him, Pele, Bibidi Pele and Papan. Between the three of them, absolutely fantastic. And he, as you said, was given a free role. Could always do what he wanted. He wasn't hugging the left touch line, getting chalk on his boots and whipping in balls. He was able to basically express himself and be free. And that's the player that we needed. We needed someone like that who could do that. And as you said, he disregarded him. I don't understand why. And it's the same with Beardsley. He disregarded Beardsley. Very similar type of creative player, could create something, could do something, and just disregarded him. And I don't get it. I really don't get it to this day.
It's an anti-Geordie thing, that's all I can say. Because later in 1990, we had Gascoigne benched for Gordon Cowans in Ireland in a Euro 92 qualifier, didn't we? So that's all I can think. Joe, what do you think of that?
Well, the thing is, the omission of Waddle was particularly baffling because, as we all agree, he was amongst the best players in Europe and playing for one of the best teams in Europe. And he'd improved at Marseille, and he was absolutely brilliant. And when he came back to Sheffield Wednesday as well, if you forget, it was brilliant there too. Taylor really did himself in on this decision. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes he made because he never really explained it thoroughly. And when you've painted yourself into a corner, you have to wait for the paint to dry and then pick your way out, right? In Taylor's case, qualifying for the USA in 1994 would have been picking his way out. But that never happened, so he never got the chance. And it actually got to a point where it was so resolute about it. If he'd come back to pick Waddle, it would have been seen as weak management because he so clearly didn't want to pick him. And even if it was the right decision, it would have been seen as wrong somehow. And it was baffling, especially as Waddle would have been the perfect balance to the good, solid professional grinders there was in the team at the time. It would have provided some balance, a bit of guile, a bit of craft. Instead, in 1992, we just plundered along to Sweden, and it was just we had nothing. And in those games in Sweden, the first two, we battled well. We're all well organised, very Graham Taylor, but we never looked remotely like scoring in either of those two games. And Waddle's the kind of person who could have provided a bit of craft. So that was just, it was a baffler.
There were two things, I'll go back to the paranoia. There's an ego there, a really big ego. And it's an ego that stems from inferiority, not superiority. It's somebody who is battling, I think, that notion that he's been elevated into a position. Imposter syndrome, actually, if you like, because first thing he does in Italy, before the third place playoff in Italian 90, he takes Laurie McMenemy, spots him in the hotel, takes him out for dinner, and sells him that job, sells him that number 2 job. And then Taylor's announced, and Laurie McMenemy isn't the assistant manager. He's the assistant to the manager. There's a difference there. There's a guy here who's hugely experienced, more experienced than Taylor, more successful than Taylor as a manager, who's been brought in as an assistant to the manager, but not an assistant manager. And it's that small detail. And even McMenemy spots that and says, well, okay, I've been put in my place here. This is with hindsight, I have to say. I'm in my place here and I will sit where I have to. I'm not going to be a threat and he doesn't need to worry about me. But to go on to what Joe said, about the players. He's not going to recall those players because he's alienated them. He's removed them out the firing line. Lineker's still there because he's scoring goals. He can't remove Lineker from that team. And the one thing that I will say in his favour, there are a few things, and I know that Dave Bowler, who obviously is a colleague of ours on this podcast and on this series, always talks about lucky managers, lucky chairmen, lucky generals. Graham Taylor was an absolutely hopeless person in that respect. He was the unluckiest England manager of all time for many reasons, but he didn't help himself, okay? And one of the big things that he really had against him, and it starts to creep in to the early 1990s, we're getting that first cohort of players who haven't played in Europe. The Heysel disaster has denied people like Andy Sinton, Carlton Palmer, Keith Curle, other people like that chance to play in European competitions, which ordinarily English footballers would have. And if people are listening to that and kind of shrugging the shoulders and say, well, what's the issue there? There's a whole process of education. There's a whole process of going and being schooled in different styles of football, in different territories, different countries, different regions, different climates. All of these things were denied to England players, club players in England, until they got to the England team. And then suddenly they're thrust into it in the main. None of them have played there, but they're thrust into it and having to adapt quickly. And I do feel that Taylor, for all the many things he got wrong, for the paranoia and the ego that he had, I think he was so unlucky to be that first man to latch onto that team that we had such a love for in 1990 and build on that, and then find all of a sudden the roots of talent, the pathways of talent that he's got him through aren't there. They're coming through, but they're not good enough. And I think that was such a big problem for him.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I think there's a fair bit to that. But as you say, didn't help himself either by turning away from experience and flair. And there was with European experience in the case of Waddle we talked about. And I can't remember who it was who flagged, obviously, the Waddle and Gascoigne link. They were very close, far more than Beardsley was with either of those, I think, is probably fair to say. So the loss of Waddle will have impacted Gascoigne hugely. I know they'd separated at club level already by this point, hadn't they? But yeah, there we go. But let's bring us on into Euro 1992 then. We've already mentioned it was actually a fairly good start to Taylor's reign, a decent unbeaten run. And they managed qualification by hook or by crook, I suppose. It wasn't plain sailing by any means, but they still managed to finish top of the group ahead of Ireland, who they drew with twice away, that one with Gascoigne on the bench late 1990, and then at home a few months later in early 1991. Poland just one further point behind. It was very tight at the top. Turkey were the ones who were the whipping boys at this point still, even though they're only a few years away from being competitive. England sealing qualification and the final match day with a late Lineker equaliser in Poznan in Poland to deny Chris's other team. Once again, that's the way of things at this point. We played Poland every single time. But yeah, England have made it through what was a tricky group. So, Michael, optimism ahead of the tournament. You know, we mentioned that there was a view of like England could go on and win, but with everything we've said about the players, was that a realistic thing? Like Joe's already mentioned how difficult scoring was or would become in this tournament for England. The style of play, the lack of trust in ability, or for whatever reason, as Chris has highlighted, of lacking the skillful players. We've got Denmark suddenly replacing Yugoslavia, which should give you a bit of optimism in theory. We'll see how that plays out. Plus France, who'd qualified by beating everybody, and the host Sweden. So it's not easy, but equally not insurmountable.
No, I think if you look at the group, the fact Yugoslavia have gone, you'd be basically shaking your hand, rubbing your hands together, thinking, Denmark's, that's the old metaphor, just come off the beach. So you think, that's an easy result, an easy game, which obviously is not. In terms of optimism going in, I think the problem is he has a number of injuries just before the tournament. We haven't qualified in any decent fashion at all, really. I think Poland beat Ireland, and if Poland or Ireland drew, or Poland didn't, or if Ireland beat Poland, then we wouldn't have gone through anyway. It'd been Ireland. I think it's almost as tight as that, and Ireland have got the better goal difference as well.
It was a very late goal in that one as well.
Yeah,
Michael at 86th minute equaliser.
Yeah, exactly. So Poland did us a massive favour. So, but yeah, I think the media I wouldn't say we're actually that optimistic. I think Graham Taylor is very optimistic. I think there's a clip where he basically says, "Oh, we're going to win it." And this isn't in the Taylor documentary. This is in I can't remember if it was on St. Greaves or something else I've seen. No, I think the way we're playing, the way we're struggling to score goals, the friendlies leading up to Euro 92, there's the Brazil game, isn't there, of course? There's the Panenka that doesn't go in from Lineker. There's a game against Finland where Barnes gets injured. They're all very, very sort of turgid games. There's no flair, there's no imagination. And France, to be fair, going to this tournament, one of the favourites, because you said they won 10 out of 10 or something. But again, we had beaten them in qualifications, but we had beaten them in the February 2-0 at Wembley with Shearer and Lineker scoring. And that was one of our better results, apart from obviously Jeff Thomas and that famous chip that ends up hitting the corner flag. But yeah, I think optimism, probably not. And I think if you look in hindsight and you look at the squad, definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, the squad list. Chris Woods is the number one goalkeeper with Nigel Martin in reserve. We have, as we've mentioned, Keith Curle. Stuart Pearce brings a little bit of nous, but they've got Keogh and Des Walker still there, but not quite the Des Walker that was 1990. He'd had his sojourn to Italy by now, which didn't go that well, and his confidence took a knock that I don't think ever fully recovered. Mark Wright's in there with a bit of expertise as well, but we've still got the likes of Dorigo in the background. Platt and Stephen are there, but again, Nigel Clough, Andy Sinton, Carlton Palmer. We've got Tony Daly, a young David Batty. We've got a very young Shearer as well, as you mentioned at this point. Neil Webb and Merson with also in there. There's not a lot of experience once you've gone past the likes of Lineker and Nigel Clough, I should mention, were in there too. But Clough, age 26, but not very experienced, not at an elite club at this stage. You've got a fair number of people with very small number of caps and just a couple with a bit more. It just doesn't seem to have the depth, the experience, the know-how that other squads have had, unless I'm being harsh. Thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, as I just said, they don't have any. There wasn't much craft there. There wasn't much guile. There wasn't anything to unlock a defence. And as Chris referred to earlier, when you're dealing with the kind of situation like that, when you're playing overseas, dealing with more sophisticated, varying styles of defence, you need more than we had. Which is why some of the omissions proved very costly, I would say. And they were just solid, rock solid professional footballers. That's it. And they're very good ones. I wouldn't deny any of them their place in the England squad because they got picked and everything. But at the same time, there wasn't much going on, was there? And with that as well, surely the manager should have worked out a way to get the most from them to try and win games. Instead, we just plodded on. And Stuart Pearce at the bar with a free kick against France. Then he got elbowed in the face by Bowley. And that it was just really nondescript football from a nondescript team, So nothing happened. and that was where all the joy and optimism and thrill of Italia 90 finally ended, because it was almost back to normal. It was almost as if we should be grateful for what we had because we're not worthy. And it was just pretty turgid stuff for the most part in that tournament. It wasn't a great tournament either.
This was the final tournament before the back pass law came in. And just to pick up on what Joe said there, the team that finishes against Sweden, it's very inexperienced. I mentioned earlier about the Heysel ban and the impact of that. There aren't many players there. And obviously Lineker's gone off by this point. There aren't many players in that 11 who finished the game who have got a huge amount of European experience. Some haven't got any experience at all of playing club football. But what we see in Euro 92 is the beginning of the deterioration of that relationship that you mentioned earlier, Aidan, about the manager and the press. Because up until then, he's getting a fairly easy ride. Yeah, and France are fairly fancied. England get a draw, okay. Denmark have obviously come in from the coast, as we're led to believe, and that's not a great result. Then they lose to Sweden. But crucially, and this is the smallest of things that really changed the equilibrium of relationships, it's during this tournament that a young Alan Shearer is in the England camp. Yeah, he's not playing. not involved. He's getting wind of the England teams because the manager's announcing the England team. And Alan Shearer, in his enthusiasm, in his maybe naivety, is informing a guy called Jack Hickson, who, Aidan, you might know from the North East, a big scout, very close to Alan Shearer. Jack Hickson is then passing on the England team news to journalists in the North East. Those journalists are then informing their desks in London, who are then going back to the journalists who are in Spain, in Sweden, in Malmo, in Gothenburg, wherever they are, saying, how come you guys haven't got this England team? And our Geordie reporters are feeding back to us the team. How the hell can you be in Sweden and not know the team? And this might seem like a really stupid, inconsequential detail, but it chips away at that relationship. And all of a sudden, the press, Fleet Street's finest, are losing faith, not only in the manager's ability to lead the team and to manage the team and to coach the team, but that relationship, that trust is being chipped away. And it's during this period that when the team are flying from games, Taylor changes the whole chemistry, even on the planes. Instead of having the players and the media travelling together with the statesmen and the coaches at the front, all of a sudden Taylor says, well, actually, we're going to put a barrier. We're going to have a line of personnel in the plane who are going to be between the players and the press, so the press can't get to the players. And it's these small details that start to chip away at the press. And of course, you go into Euro 92 full of optimism. You've had a fantastic World Cup in 1990. The world, Europe is expecting this England team to perform, and then they completely bomb. And this is where the deterioration really sets in Euro 92. That relationship between Taylor and the press starts to falter, and it starts to falter badly. And it falters very much in the aftermath of the Sweden game, Michael, doesn't it? I mean, one player I didn't mention in my list of players there was Alan Smith. Now, he features in this Sweden game. England actually took the lead, didn't they, through David Platt, a bit of a scuffed effort that bounced over and in. At that point, England were heading for the semi-finals, but come the end of the match, they very much were not. Jan Eriksson taking advantage of a bit of slack marking, and Thomas Brolin with a superb goal, the combination with Martin Darling. Brolin, brilliant, went the commentary. Nice line. But we had the Lineker substitution, Michael. I think something we definitely have to touch on, the impact, with hindsight, I suppose, of that. But you're in a situation where it was 1-1 at the time, but England needed to win to go through. And who's the person to rely on most for goals is, of course, Lineker. Hindsight is everything, though, of course, isn't it? You know, in the aftermath of defeat, it's very easy to say, well, he should have stayed on. But he should have stayed on, shouldn't he, Michael?
Definitely. I think when you look at his records in international goals, you need a goal. He's a goal scorer. You need him on the pitch. I know he hadn't scored in something like 7 games going into Euro 92 or something like that. He didn't seem as if he had much confidence, but to counteract that, he was actually getting no service, to be fair, because there was just no creativity in this team, like we've already touched upon. But to take him off for Alan Smith, and I think Alan Smith's instructions is to hold the ball up. Well, that's all well and good to hold the ball up, but you need to hold the ball up for someone to play off. And you've taken that player off that you would be holding the ball up to support and try and create a chance for. So that makes no logical sense to me whatsoever. So the fact you're taking off your goal scorer and bringing on someone to hold the ball up to create for a goal scorer who's not on the pitch doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. It's one of those really ironic or iconic photos, isn't it? That, you know, you see him looking at the bench, looking back at the pitch, you know, Smith coming on the pitch. It's one of the most famous photos of probably English football. And it's a real sad end to Lineker's sort of international career. I don't disdoubt for 1 minute that Taylor's done it with the intention of trying to score a goal, and then Lineker would then play in the semi-final. I don't disdoubt that. I don't think for 1 minute he went there with the intention to cut his England career short there and then, and that was over and done with. But it just makes no logical sense. And of course, as you rightfully said, you know, Brolin scores that fantastic goal, and we're going home. But touching back on the players, you know, that at this tournament, you know, you look at the players that he doesn't take that he could have taken. It is absolutely shocking. You know, the likes of Ian Wright. You know, if Ian Wright came on in that game, you would understand perhaps trying to get a goal, or if he came off Alan Smith came on and Ian Wright come on at the same time. That makes a bit of sense. But, he hasn't got Waddle, he hasn't got Beardsley, but he didn't take Pallister and didn't take Lee Sharp. Now, I don't know if Lee Sharp had meningitis at this point, but there were players there we could have taken that we didn't, and it just really comes back to bite him.
It does. Well, Shearer was there, of course, as we mentioned. I mean, whether he'd have been option again, very inexperienced at this point. But as we mentioned, he'd scored in his debut against France only a few months earlier. So yes, you're absolutely right, Michael. There were many good options that he refused to countenance or to bring, but there were still other options there if he felt Lineker didn't have anything more to give in that particular game. But Chris, in terms of press, you mentioned it there. I'll just come back to you again on this one, because obviously this led to the very famous tabloid headline of Swedes 2, Turnips 1. Similar levels of abuse that Bobby Robson endured, rather than enjoyed, I should say, during elements of his reign. It seemed to me that the tabloid press war was still very much at its peak, I think, around this time. And you could probably speculate that any coach would have suffered this level of abuse, but those areas you've already highlighted of the lack of trust, those issues you're talking about of building a figurative and literal wall possibly between the camps, has possibly then, when you don't deliver, leads to this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things there. I mean, to take it back to 1990, you've got strong characters in that team. You've got Peter Shilton, you've got Terry Butcher, you've got Brian Robson. These are players who don't take any crap, when it comes to the whole notion of how Team England, in inverted commas, is treated and how the press treat them. And actually, all of the individuals I've mentioned, certainly Butcher and Robson, generally had a good relationship with the press. By the time you get to 92, you've got a different dynamic. You've got very untried, untested players. You've got rookie players who are seasoned campaigners in the first division, but are they England quality? Possibly not. I mean, Michael reeled off some names who could and should have been on England duty. I'll never, ever understand, for instance, Steve Bruce never getting a single cap. So what you have by 1992, you've got that vulnerability within the England camp where there is no seniority other than Lineker, who's a nice bloke. And you've got a media scrum who are rabid. And you mentioned the tabloid wars. I think you mentioned the tabloid wars. If not, I'll explain the tabloid wars. It was the concept of the Mirror and the Sun, and I think the Today newspaper very much at the time, who were effectively scrambling around in a pre-internet age for readers. And these were newspapers getting several million, having circulations of several million a day, readerships 3 times more than that. So they were against each other. The journalists were against each other, trying to get as many different stories as they could. And I'll return back to that citation earlier of how annoyed the papers were to find Alan Shearer leaking the news to journalists by another person in the northeast. This was a rabid battle between the tabloid press, and the fact that this was an England squad that was relatively rookie, relatively fresh, relatively wet behind the ears, dare I say, in terms of dealing with things like that, with a manager who had never been under this kind of spotlight before. He'd managed at Watford, where he'd been very much in the provincial part of the football media world. Even at his very most successful, there wasn't a huge spotlight on Watford. He goes to Villa, and he does a good job. And actually, interestingly, when he's at Villa in his first spell, he never has a period of pressure. So he's never having to deal with any spotlight that might come onto Villa, because it's all plain sailing, relatively speaking. They're not expected to finish second in the first division as it was then. So actually, Graham Taylor's time at Villa is very smooth, and it doesn't prepare him for what comes when he's England manager. And the press are getting ready for him, and they're biting at him, snapping at his heels. And it all comes to a head, as you say, with that infamous tabloid war and that headline, Swedes 2, Turnips 1. That isn't even going to be in the top 3 stories or headlines that emerged during Graham Taylor's time as England manager. And that's really a sign of where the tabloid press was at the time, but also the naivety of a manager who is seemingly, at this point, completely out of his depth.
Yeah, any of the goodwill from his earlier run in late 1990, early 1991 is a long time ago at this point, even though in actual fact it isn't that long, but all goodwill has pretty much gone. And Joe, we're now heading into the USA 1994 World Cup qualifiers. Optimism's gone, like I say. The pressure on him is now huge. He has to deliver. There is no margin for error for him now at all, is there? And we're coming into a World Cup group in which two teams can qualify automatically. There is Poland and Turkey, just as they had been in Euro 92 qualifying. San Marino as the perennial whipping boys, but they will feature in our story later. And Norway and the Netherlands are the two tougher ones. But Norway had achieved nothing by this point. We knew several of their players from the English League because that's where we went for foreigners in those days. And a few names were familiar, but they'd achieved very, very little other than beating England in the early 80s, which we know all about thanks to our podcast title. But there you go. That would not be the last time they would humiliate an English team in World Cup qualifying, shall we say.
Yeah.
Things went from bad in the summer of 92 to worse quite quickly, I suppose, or maybe not immediately, but England began with a 1-1 draw against Norway, having gone in front and thrown it away. And they were sort of almost chasing their tail after that, despite there was wins against Turkey and San Marino and again away against Turkey. But then we have the Netherlands and Norway coming up after that, Joe, don't we? And it really hits the skids.
The first one against Norway, where we actually played really well, but we were only 1-0 up after about an hour. And then they equalised, which was actually a really good strike by Rekdal. That was a really good goal, but I didn't enjoy it. That sort of set the tone. And in this campaign, and this is what I know about footballers sometimes, not afterwards, David Platt, after the campaign, said the only reason we didn't qualify was because of the ref away to the Netherlands, right? We were ahead at home and didn't win. Now, that's why we didn't qualify. If we'd beaten Norway...
We were 2-0 up against the Dutch at times as well, weren't we?
Yeah, for a big chunk of the game, we're 2-0 up. Against Norway, we didn't play that badly, but again, there comes a point where you have to convert being superiority to cold-blooded winning. And when Rekdal equalised, we were never going to get back in it. We were never going to get the lead back. And we never looked likely to, actually. We looked a bit crestfallen and felt a bit sorry for ourselves. And it was sort of really bland and infuriating because it just seemed to be a continuation of what had gone on in the European Championship a few months before. And we beat Turkey in style, and that was enjoyable. But it wasn't the mighty Turkey that emerged a few years later. There was the game against San Marino where we won 6-0, I think, and the crowd were on the back, and in that wretched documentary, Graham Taylor sort of sitting on the bench saying, we'll get slaughtered for this, won't we? Oh, and it was a man, as I saw him described, Taylor was a man not waving but drowning. That was, and that summed it up. And as we will always come back to, he really didn't help himself in a lot of respects.
Well, the documentary was one area he didn't help himself, and we will very much come on to that in detail, I think. But continuing through this campaign, and you touched on that San Marino game. There's another one later we will obviously get to too. The fact that England were beating them 6-0, you mentioned the crowd on the back. Norway had beaten San Marino 10-0 in the opening game of the group, and I think that's probably where some of that stems from. If Norway have scored 10, if we only get 6, that is terrible. And it doesn't help. But then, Michael, we get into real difficulty with a couple of away games at the end of the season in the summer of 1993. England go to Poland first, and very, very late, again, another late equaliser in Poland. Ian Wright this time rescuing a point, just as had happened a couple of years earlier in Euro qualifying. And then the trip to Norway. This doesn't go well at all, Michael, does it? He tries to tweak things. He tries to be clever, alter the formation, try to do things a little differently. And is this a case of him being tactically found out at this point?
I think in the Norway game, yes. I think in the Poland game, I think the players just perform so poorly. They do in both games, to be fair. But I think Gascoigne has an absolute shocker in the Poland game. Chris Woods, he kicks the ball back to one of the players. He goes to clear the ball, miskicks it, and luckily he saves it. But Des Walker's having an absolute mare at the moment. As you know, he's obviously gone to Sampdoria and he's really, really struggling. He's lost all his confidence, but he's also lost his pace as well. And then, of course, the Poland goal is a bad pass from Walker to Barnes. Barnes can't control it. It bounces back, and the Walker gets done for pace. And he's already been done for pace in the Netherlands game by Overmars, if you remember, when he gives away the penalty. So he's already been exposed once, and it was the goal, the Poland goal, and obviously that's when you get the classic do or not like that as he goes through, and the ball sort of loops over sort of Chris Woods. And you're right. We're lucky to get an equaliser from Ian Wright, and of course there's that moment on the documentary where he's basically said this game's made for Wrighty to come off the bench, and it's exactly what happens, and that's probably one of the only things he actually predicts in that documentary that actually comes off. But I know we'll talk about the documentary separately. The Norway game, that's the one that obviously he's really concerned about. I think, was it Justin Flo, which is Tori Andre Flo's sort of brother, and he's playing in the Norwegian second division. I mean, they're worried about him playing on the left or the right, and I think he puts Pallister out there to man mark him in a three-man sort of back three, and plays wing backs, and just goes against almost everything that England are used to, or in the club, in the domestic scene, how players are used to playing. Plays a new formation that these players do not understand. Gascoigne has an absolute shocker again in this game. I think he's almost basically said to be Norway's man of the match almost. And we get completely done. I think Des Walker is at fault for the first goal. He gives away a free kick, turns his back, he's arguing. Before he knows it, Norway have scored. And I think the last second goal, Chris Woods goes down too early and the ball goes over his head at the near post. And I think within sort of those two games, within the space of 4 or 5 days, our qualification is in tatters. And I know that other teams in this group, or mainly the Netherlands, keep dropping points themselves, which means we do at the end have a chance still. But this 4 days away were the key games, and we well and truly messed it up. And
a few days later, or a week or so later, it got even more calamitous. Well, less critical, I suppose, but embarrassing again, because we went to the USA for a pre-World Cup USA Cup friendly tournament. Let's get used to the conditions over there. That'll be great for the following summer. What a great plan. And England lose 2-0 to the USA. Alexi Lalas famously scoring, becoming a known figure over here, and obviously he would go on to be well seen in the World Cup the following year, unlike any of the English players he was facing that day. But again, that just, it seemed like a calamitous time off the back of these two vital qualifiers to have come with 1 point from that road trip from Poland and Norway. The manner of it in Oslo was really troubling. To then go to the USA and get beaten, it just all seemed to be going wrong. And then we come into the final games of qualifying in the autumn of 1993. There was that key match in Rotterdam, obviously San Marino famously is the other game England played at that time, but it's the one in Netherlands that proved decisive, I suppose. But you're absolutely right. It was Joe pointing out that this isn't where it was lost as such. It was all of the other drop points. Any one of those going a bit differently might have altered the path of England's fortunes. But this game in Rotterdam, it was an incredible game. And Chris, I remember watching this. This is my university years now. It was my first year at uni. We were watching it in the student apartment in the student hall, basically, with a whole bunch of people all yelling at this tiny little TV that was up in the corner. Bits of furniture got kicked. But really, everybody, kind of felt it was coming a lot. But if ever there was an occasion where Graham Taylor was massively unlucky, this was it.
This is where the panto Graham Taylor kicks in, isn't it? I mean, I know we're going to talk a bit more about the documentary shortly, but there's a real shift in that period between Poland, Norway and USA. Poland is obviously, as Michael alluded to, it was awful, absolutely awful. Poland should have won, really, with better finishing. They would have won. And Taylor takes the players into the dressing room after and kind of says, well, we need to try and not lose against Norway. And he's already instilling this kind of defeatist mentality into them that obviously sees them lose to Norway, which is a disaster. It tactically, he's questioned because he changes the system. And then they go and lose to America. And I mentioned earlier, there were a few other headlines that were worse, and it was Yanks 2, Planks 0, if I recall correctly. So that takes them into this Netherlands game in this state of malaise, really. And if you had to sum up Graham Taylor's time as England manager, you could basically take that 90 minutes against the Netherlands and present it as a catalogue of everything that went wrong. He's unlucky. He's unlucky in that because Koeman should be sent off. He's unlucky because Koeman, who should be sent off, scores the goal at a second attempt after the first free kick is beaten down by Paul Ince, I think it is. But he's also a little bit fortunate because Rijkaard has a perfectly good goal disallowed. No idea why that goal's disallowed. So the Netherlands should be winning in many respects. But then you're also seeing the flaws of the man. You're also seeing the guy who just looks like he's lost, no longer performing to the team, but performing for himself. And I find I really, when I watched the documentary back, and we were preparing for this, and I watched that documentary a few days ago, and everything is Graham Taylor. Everything is about Graham Taylor. You have cost me this match, linesman. You please tell your colleague he has cost me this match. Everything's about Graham Taylor. And it just feels like he's just not comprehending what this defeat has done for a country, not quite comprehending what this team has done for players who might not get to play in a World Cup again, not quite comprehending the fact that actually a lot of the mistakes he's made, a lot of the selections he's made have contributed to this. The Norway defeat, the very, very lucky draw in Poland. They beat Poland comprehensively 3-0, which kind of sets a false tone before Netherlands. And that whole game against Netherlands, where it just feels like when you look at that team on paper, Netherlands are far better than England, for starters. But we have this hope that an England team will galvanise and get that result, that they will get that draw or whatever they need. And it never seems like it with a Graham Taylor England. And it just really, really illustrates everything that Graham Taylor's England reign was about, to the point that the England goalkeeper, David Seaman, at the second free kick that Koeman takes, is miles out of position. Even the commentator, Brian Moore, is going to flick one, and you're looking at Seaman thinking, does he know this is going to be retaken? Does he know what's going on here? And of course he's beaten. And it just feels like it feels like a Panto-esque. It feels like a scripted England disaster. We've recently had the Dear England thing with Gareth Southgate, but this almost feels like it was part of a script. And I'm sure that it would go on to inspire Dave. Is it Mike Bassett, Dave Bassett? I always forget which one. Mike Bassett.
One of those people is real.
Yeah. I feel like it inspired that genre, because you could not get a more hapless match, more hapless England match in so many ways. And we wax lyrical about the England game against Mexico a couple of months ago in the World Cup. And for all the opposite reasons, the same could be said about this England game in Netherlands. For all the wrong reasons, it was such a seminal match for all the wrong reasons.
And things couldn't possibly get worse or more embarrassing from here, could they? They couldn't possibly. And yet, we have the San Marino debacle that ended things. England still held the slimmest of hopes of qualifying. They needed Poland to either beat or hold the Dutch. I can't remember whether they had to win, but either way, if the Dutch won in Poland, it was all done and dusted. But England started to, even with a result there going in their favour, England would have had to have won by 7, I think it was, against San Marino to have snuck through. But instead, they managed to concede against the worst team in Europe, or some may even say the world, after just 8 seconds, having had the kickoff. England had the kickoff themselves and managed to contrive a situation there that let the worst team in the world score after 8 seconds. Davide Gualtieri, the toast of every Scotsman forever. Incredible. The final insult, if you like, on Graham Taylor's calamitous last couple of years of his campaign. Again, I remember watching this one in the student digs. To be honest, people just burst out laughing when that goal went in. It was beyond parody by this stage. And later on in proceedings, as we all know, the transmission switched to Cardiff to watch to see Wales against Romania in their decisive game, which didn't go great for them. And we switched in time to see Paul Bowden's penalty smashing the crossbar when Wales had potential qualification in their grasp. Romania obviously went on and did quite well that summer. But yeah, this was quite the ending. England did go on and win 7-1. Ian Wright scored 4, but it took 22 minutes to equalise, let alone to get in front, which didn't happen until closer to half-time. It was quite incredible. But anyway, if that was bad, let's get on to it now. A certain documentary that then came out, The Impossible Job. We need to get into this. Everybody's mentioned it already as we've gone through, and some of the famous quotes and images of the hapless Taylor as it went through. But to talk about the documentary itself, it's an incredible watch, Joe. There's no doubting that. As an observer from the outside, it is astonishing the amount of insight you get. It was really, really interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Who thought this was a good idea?
Whose idea was it? What was the thinking behind it? Was it done as a when the World Cup's imminent, as we'll put this documentary on, this is how England got there? Or was it just general for somebody doing it for archive material for the future so we can reflect on it like this? What was the idea behind it? Has it ever been fully explained? Or is it meant to be?
He was already on a hiding to nothing, as we said, from 92. If this was meant to be a chronicle of his success, he was already in a bad place.
Yeah, there was some animosity between Taylor and McMenemy over the filming. McMenemy wasn't pleased with it, and they had a bit of a falling out over it. And it was just. I'll always wonder why, and and if anybody knows, just let us know, because I've never had a thorough explanation.
It was Taylor. It was down to Taylor, absolutely down to Taylor. And you're absolutely right. There was animosity. McMenemy was furious about it. The first, he started to get an inkling about it. He one of the away games, he knocked on the hotel door that Graham was staying in, and there was a pause, there was a delay. He knew Graham was in there, but he didn't know what's going on. Door opened, cameras are in there. And he sort of thought, well, okay, they're interviewing him. And it was against Norway. So that Norway game where they're getting pretty brutally battered in that defeat, where Graham Taylor's unusually really robust in the way he's dealing in his team talk. He's not like that. He's very demonstrative. And Loving McMenemy actually says in his book that he looks around and he sees a lot of the England players looking at him and looking back and rolling their eyes thinking, this isn't right. And it's at that point that afterwards they start discussing the fact that they notice that there are wires coming out of Graham Taylor's shell suit or whatever he's wearing. He's wired up. And from that moment on, if you look at that documentary, Loving McMenemy, every time he's in the stand, every time he's in the dugout, sorry, not the stand, he's looking nervously. He's looking at the floor. He's looking around because he knows they're being filmed. And he was never asked about it. He was never consulted about it. It was never put on the table to him, would you agree to this? And this is another example of a man's ego who wants to project himself as this new wave manager who has new ideas. And McMenemy was furious about it because he did not know a thing about this. And he was so angry to see it play out the way it did. And of course, you mentioned the San Marino game. There's a great anecdote in Laurie McMenemy's book that he wasn't at the San Marino match, the match that England won 7-1. He took charge of, I think, either an under-21s or a B match. And they got on the coach after the match and somebody said, there's been a goal. There's been a goal in the San Marino England game. He assumed somebody had put the put England ahead. They said, actually, no, San Marino scored. And he ordered the driver to turn the radio off. And that's the effect that by then McMenemy and the impact that documentary had on McMenemy. And he said it impacted on Phil Neal, Peter Bonetti, who was a goalkeeping coach, and also John Gardner, who was the psychologist who was on tour with them during that period. He said they hated it. They did not agree with it at all. And it's really, I think it's quite interesting that by the end, that relationship between McMenemy and Taylor's gone. It is really gone. And in the Graham Kelly book, Graham Kelly, of course, was a senior member of the FA and the Football League during this period. He actually said that it got so bad that when it became obvious that Taylor was in a place where he might have to resign, he said he would not resign if there was any danger of Laurie McMenemy being named as his successor. And I think that is so damning, really, of how that relationship between Taylor and McMenemy deteriorated. The fact that by the end of that period, it looked like that Taylor was so paranoid of McMenemy that he thought he would actually replace him. And that's in Graham Kelly's book, the guy who was in charge of them all. So it goes to show really just how damaging that whole documentary was.
And Michael, for Taylor personally, aside from all these relationships as well, I mean, it made him into a laughingstock, didn't it? I mean, I guess this airs after all the calamity has happened. I can't remember exactly when it came out, but we've lived through all of these games. We've seen the disasters of it. And then this comes out and it makes everything look even worse. I mean, for him personally, the way he came across, like I say, a bit of a joke, a bit of a laughingstock. I don't know. It's got to have been very, very tough for him, but he did not come across well.
No, I think if you watched it at the time, I think obviously the emotions are quite raw because obviously we haven't qualified, and then you're always having a look at what's everything that's gone wrong, and then you're seeing the insight and you're seeing all this man sort of. And at the latter part, like Chris has always said with the media and, him always becoming all about himself, you almost see him falling apart and he becomes almost like a parody figure. But I think at the start of it, it obviously start off with optimism as you would do at the beginning of a qualifying period. But I think he does come across as a bit of a hapless figure at the end. But I also think if you watch it now, and I don't know what you guys think, I almost feel quite sorry for him if you watch it now because, he's not dealt the best of hands in terms of luck throughout that tournament with injuries, but he doesn't help himself with decisions, with selections, as we've talked about throughout this. But I think if you watch it now, I do think he's actually trying to do the right thing in a lot of cases. He just gets it wrong. I think he's trying to be too accommodating to the press. He's trying to do the right thing. He thinks he has a relationship with the press because of his dad and everything, as Chris has already alluded to earlier on. But of course, he gets that wrong as well. And I just think it's almost, I think if you watch it today, I think in hindsight, I think he comes across better than he did at the time. And I think you feel a bit more sorry for him, a bit more sympathy and a bit more sympathetic. But ultimately, he gets it wrong. And of course, this documentary just showcases that. But it also showcases, I think what I find funny in this documentary is Phil Neal. You just find him almost like the shadow and the echo. Everything that Taylor says, he just seems to sort of agree with and nod and just seem to go, bold decision, and all things like that. And he becomes a parody figure as well, which maybe that's unfair on him. And maybe that's because he doesn't know he's been filmed, or he does know he's been filmed. And I don't know. But yeah, I think when you look back at it, when you watched it, he comes across as a hapless, not an idiot, but just a bit of a parody and a bit of a joke.
We can look back on it now with nostalgia, but it was first shown in January 1994, and the draw had been made for the World Cup, and we weren't in it, so it was all a bit raw. And it's nostalgia. At the time, it was real. At the time, it was so recent. We could reflect on what had actually happened and what had actually done our chances in of even being at a World Cup. So it feels better now because it's fun. But at the time, it was a lot of people were incredulous about it. It was it was just not a good episode in the history of the England team. I mean, so why did the FA approve it? I assume they did. It was just really, really just a bizarre set of circumstances and unnecessarily intrusive. And the players couldn't have been pleased about it. It all seems to be to fuel Taylor's ego.
But it is superb to look back on, let's be honest. Yeah. It is absolute gold mine, especially for those of us who remember the time. It really is. But I wonder, Chris, of other impact, of whether it's had an impact at the time and going forwards on the role of England manager. The term "the impossible job" was the title of the documentary, but that's a phrase that's been termed for many an England manager across the years. Did it make it all the harder for what would come next? I mean, we're at a point, though, I suppose, where we're 2.5 years away from another competitive match now, because England were hosting the next tournament, Euro 96. So the person who is yet to be appointed at this point would be Venables. And maybe he's the kind of perfect character, really, to not be affected by that, because he was so positive and upbeat rather than drowning, as you'd said earlier. But did this documentary have an impact on the role?
I mean, it doesn't help Taylor that, his spelling charge is bookended by England finishing in the semi-finals of the 1990 World Cup and in the semi-finals of the 1996 Euros. It makes his legacy look even worse than it was, whatever the reasons might be. And, being a host nation in 96, and actually England didn't play particularly well during that tournament. They had a couple of decent, really good games against the Netherlands and Germany. But I think it really showcased the pressures of being an England manager, of being that kind of personality cocooned in a world that nobody else can appreciate. There's a great clip in that documentary where Graham Taylor's being powdered up in makeup before an appearance on Pebble Mill at one. And he's sat next to a comedian. I can't remember the guy's name, actually, who the comedian is, but they're having a conversation about how Graham Taylor is the second kind of, he's kind of detracting from Princess Diana, and he's more popular and more media focused, or rather media is more focused on him than Princess Diana at that point, who's the most famous woman in the world. And it kind of really showcases what the England job is about. And I think, given that what happened in 1990 with Bobby Robson and the euphoria and really the way that World Cup was presented, and I think it was this period of the 90s is a real golden age of England coming to the fore in tournaments, and the way tournaments are projected, the way the England managers are projected. We mentioned here the failure of Taylor. Well, there's a failure of two England managers in the 1970s. We've not spoken about them in that same way. There's a failure of Steve McClaren in 2008. We've not spoken about it in that way, nor of Capello, because Graham Taylor put himself very much at the forefront in the focus of showing people what it was like to be an England manager. And whether you agree with that or not, whether it was a vanity project or not, and I think it was to a degree, I think there's an element of really the result of it is that actually people did have sympathy. People did think, well, this is such a bad place to be for anyone, for any individual to have to cope with this, to have to deal with this, to have the media mocking you and controlling you the way they do. And, I mentioned it earlier, it was the inspiration for a film a few years later with Ricky Tomlinson. You watch that Ricky Tomlinson film, Mike Bassett, it is basically a parody of The Impossible Job, and yet The Impossible Job seemed like a parody of something that should have been a normal documentary, and that's really the result of what Graham Taylor wanted to do.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, looking ahead for him, I guess Taylor's career as a whole and his time overall is viewed much more sympathetically as the years have gone by, I suppose, and he's always been viewed as a very decent man in who had an awful time of it. We've talked about the things he's done to make it worse, the documentary not least, but equally he was a very, very good manager who was possibly promoted beyond his ability or into somewhere where he was outside his comfort zone. Michael, do you think? I mean, what do you think the legacy overall of this period of Taylor's career has had on his whole career? Still viewed as a successful manager, but with a big asterisk against it.
I think with Taylor, I think he's always really good club manager, but international just couldn't cut it. His failure at international level, and I think that does tarnish him. But I think if you look at what he does at Watford and Villa before England, and then what he does with Watford post England, because he gets them promoted to the Premier League via the playoffs, I think it is. I forgot what year it is. And I think he goes to Wolves as well. And he does a good job in his club career post England, but he's always remembered, really, I suppose, for England's failure to get the USA 94 and the documentary and all the phrases and all the phrases we used to say on the playground at school. You know, that I think that's, you know, do I not like that, and all those other ones, you know. And we were 12, 13 saying that at school, you know. And I think that's probably the sad thing, really, because, you know, when you're then listening to him as a pundit on, I think it was 5 Live, I think it was, you know, he came across really, really well, and he was very, very knowledgeable. And, you know, anyone who talks about him always says what a decent bloke he was, and really genuine and a real decent human being. But this is always just that real sort of black mark on his career is England, and it's always going to stay with him, unfortunately.
Yeah, no escape it. And Joe, your thoughts on that as well? Is it overall of Taylor as a football manager, a man, and his career, of how much this has impacted it?
It was a thoroughly decent man by all accounts, but when it came to managing England, it was just hopelessly out of his depth, hopelessly. And that, and in that respect, I sympathise with him, because if you've got ambition, if the opportunity arises, you take it. You can't not take it, otherwise you regret it forever. That's less the case now, but certainly then. And so, but he was just out of his depth, not right for the job, not correct for the job, and just wasn't up to it. If he'd stayed at Aston Villa a bit longer, he might have won a trophy, who knows. So, but all the same, he probably doesn't regret it, because you have to take the chance. So it was a long time ago, and now it's nostalgia, thankfully.
Oh God, it was a very long time ago, Joe.
Yeah,
let's be clear on that. And he probably wasn't helped by the charisma of who followed him. Terry Venables is also very
actually,
charismatic.
that's a very good point, actually, because you know, look what Venables did. And I remember Venables' first press conference at Wembley, tipping smiles, bits of PR here, little sound bites, you know, quips. Then he probably went and had a bottle of champagne at a West London club or something. But because the complete opposite. And it's probably what was required too.
Well, it's the lurch from one to the other, isn't it? But it all just suddenly had a whole positive vibe about it, even though we were, you know, at that point 2 years away from anything. England suddenly had an uptick in form. You know, Venables had his Christmas tree formation from the start, didn't he? He seemed to get more out of the players, and he introduced better players, I think. Or maybe it's just fortune that better players were coming along as well. Interesting, there's only 2 of the players from the last Euro 92 match who actually played at the start of Euro 96. It could have been 3 if Shearer had been involved, but Stuart Pearce and David Platt were the only ones who sort of spanned that spell. And that is, well, I think that's incredible. There's others who obviously went through this era too, but in terms of those that actually started and played those games, that is quite surprising. And Pearce probably wouldn't have done if Lasso had been fit for Euro 96 as well, which is, it shows the turnover and change in personnel, I suppose, that one person's misfortune is another person's fortune. And we moved into a better era for a little bit. Anyway, before we wrap things up, we'll get onto our musical interlude shortly, but quick things. We've talked through lots of calamitous times, but quickly from each of you, what was the worst moment of Taylor's regime? We've got, let's think of some of the hits. We've got the Euro 92 substitution of Lineker. We've got the debacle in Norway. We've got the San Marino goal. We've got the various comments on the documentary. We've got the USA defeat. I don't know. What do you think, Michael?
I'd always go back to probably saying Netherlands away and losing 2-0 and the whole Koeman incident. But I think when you watch the documentary, I think there's so many other turning points that makes this question really, really hard to actually say which one I actually think it is.
There's so many.
Yeah, because you can almost point down and look right at the very start and say it's Reichdale's equaliser in the 77th minute against Norway at Wembley, and that starts everything off. You can always say it's Des Walker putting down Overmars at Wembley and Van Basten scoring the penalty. I suppose looking back, I think in terms of performance, I'd probably say Norway away, to be honest, because that's the real result that probably kills us off, really. And the fact that I think Taylor tries to be clever by going 3-5-2, tries to be a tactical genius almost playing against an Eagle Olsen side that, again, is very much a side that is direct football to the extreme, which obviously Taylor probably has got the break on a little bit of going the way he maybe wanted to have played. And I think when you watch that on the documentary and you look at that one unravel and you see him literally shouting Hitler's, you tell him, and all those, you just see this man falling apart in front of your eyes. And I think that's probably the killer moment, in my opinion. But you could talk about all of them, to be honest with you. But yeah, I'd go with Norway.
Lovely. Okay, Chris, what about you?
Really easy one, in my view. It's the Sweden match. I think I've just checked the facts, the stats from that game. He withdrew Lineker after 62 minutes. There was a third of the match to go. Now, to give you context, when Lineker equalised against Germany in 1990, he did so in the 81st minute. He scored his goals against Cameroon when he did late in the game. And I think just to withdraw a guy who was still at the peak, maybe not at the apex, but certainly coming down from the peak of his career, to withdraw him for somebody like Alan Smith, no disrespect to Alan Smith, but he wasn't Gary Lineker, and he wasn't feared the way that Gary Lineker was by opposition defences. I just think that was the cusp of something that, had England gone through, let's say, gone into extra time, maybe gone on to win the game or gone on to penalties, it could have changed Graham Taylor's England, the whole course of his legacy in such a different way. But I think that set the tone really for what followed. I think everything that follows that Sweden game with that substitution in the 62nd minute is down to that one substitute. I just think it all boils down. You can pinpoint it back to Alan Smith replacing Gary Lineker, everything that follows.
Okay, then Joe, your turn.
The late penalty at home to Netherlands. I think from that point, qualification was always going to be an uphill struggle, and so it proved. And Walker got done for pace badly, and it was just really, really bleak from then on. And despite, and again, of course, we played well for the most part. Gazrid had his jaw broken, and that was like the really. I think that was the problem. I felt that was a real the first nail in the coffin of the qualification campaign, and it was a big point.
Okay, and for comedy value, I'll go for the San Marino goal, just because it caused myself in a room full of students pissed up on cheap lager to burst out laughing. But there we go. And you could probably claim the documentary was another worse moment, but maybe he technically wasn't England manager by that point, so he gets by on a technicality. Interestingly, his England career was not the lowest win percentage of any England managers. Anyone want to hazard a guess as who is the only England manager with a permanent manager, I should say, with a lower win percentage?
Reevy.
Oh, no, he's a little bit ahead of him. Only just. He's less than 1% ahead of him. No, McLaren finished with a square 50%. Graham Taylor, 47.4, it says here, according to this particular site I'm looking at.
Bobby Robson.
No, it's Kevin Keegan, actually. Kevin Keegan, my hero. It was terrible for England, but there you go. Interestingly, though, Graham Taylor, 47.4%, 18 wins out of 38 games. Only just above him on 47.8% was Terry Venables, 11 wins out of 23. So I guess it's about which games you win, though, isn't it? I suppose,
yeah.
If anything. But there we go. Up at the top of the list, Fabio Capello. There you go. It shows those stats do not tell you the whole story. They do not tell you the whole story. One other thing I would throw in is that Graham Taylor's whole regime was doomed from the start by the fact they had a terrible kit and an even worse tracksuit. And I think there is no coming back from that. He possibly should have. He wore a suit on occasion. He should have stuck to that. The tracksuit look was not good. Anyway, in fine, your boys took a hell of a beating tradition. Chris, you've been sending out the links this time, haven't you, for our little diversions into music and movies?
I sent a link of the chart between the 9th of September 1990 to the 15th of September 1990. So this was the first game, or the week of the first game, that England went under the guidance of Graham Taylor. And I asked Really, I just wanted to know what chart tickles your or what music tickles your fancy, really, in this particular chart. So, I mean, listen, I'll hand over to you guys. Michael, anything there?
Definitely What Time Is Love, KLF number 5, definitely having that one. Number 2, Groove Is in the Heart. I cannot stand that song, I'll be honest with you. Maybe that's a bit of a controversial call, but no, I can't stand that song. Suicide Blonde, In Excess. I do like In Excess. That is at 16. Listen to Your Heart, 20. Roxette. I do like Roxette. And then I was struggling, if I'm honest with you. Blaze of Glory, John Bon Jovi, 31. Right. Looking back as a kid and putting myself as a kid at this point, I will definitely have to just shout out Turtle Power, Partners in Crime, number 30. I love Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, or it was called Hero Turtles then. It's now Ninja Turtles, obviously. But yeah, it was. To be fair, it's a crap song, but from nostalgia and being a kid, that did make me smile when I saw that one this morning. But yeah, other than that, it's a very forgettable chart, which I was quite surprised about.
Well, we're among friends, so obviously that will go no further whatsoever. I shall pass no comment on that. Joe, I'm going to pass on to you. You've seen the chart as well. And Aidan, I'm going to come on to you before I tell you what the definitive answers are in this. But, okay. Joe, what have you got?
Well, I'm noticing, the song which really stands out to me is just new in at number 25, I think it was Show Me Heaven by Maria McKee. And because I remember when she was in a group called Lone Justice before that, or maybe she was at the time, and that was always an interesting thing. But mainly I'm looking at, because there were some big songs there that had loads of airplay during the World Cup and over summer on the way down. And the ones which are getting more airplay now on the way out are the ones I always remember from winter and autumn. The seasons pass and the airplay passes too, what's on the playlists. And I just remember those things. I'm Free by the Soup Dragons. That was a prominent one. Lots of airplay. That was one of the real soundtracks of that summer. Yeah, that stands out. But it was on the way down at that point. That Joker by Steve Miller Band, I couldn't stand that. And I always wondered why it was so popular.
I think it was a TV advert, possibly.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I can't remember what for.
Yeah, there were a lot of TV adverts around then, suddenly emerging into the chart. I'm with you on the Joker. I couldn't stand it. Absolutely hated it. Aidan, I'm going to hand over to you before I decide which one of you is going to be my my disc jockey for my 1990 party. Go on.
Well, yeah, I will go against what Michael said. I like Groovers in the Heart from D-Light. This was the start of my GCSE year, so I was 15, about to be 16 at this point, and daft stuff like that, a bit of the dance stuff at the school disco, that was all good. Less keen on Itsy Bitsy Teeny with a yellow polka dot bikini, which was just below it in the charts. So let's get that clear.
I actually did mute the laughter from my side. Carry on.
Yes, that was there in the charts, though, at number 3. I definitely agree with Michael on KLF, What Time Is Love. I definitely like that stuff. There's some quite cool things there. I wasn't cool enough at the time, I don't think, to appreciate Fool's Gold by Stone Roses, but that was in there. But yeah, Groovy Train by the Farm's a good one. I also liked Faith No More, Epic. The following summer, or maybe it was probably the one after that, they were supporting Guns N' Roses on their Use Your Illusion tour, and I got to see Faith No More doing that song. I don't know any other songs they did, but that one was a great one. So I liked that one, even at the time when I was a very uncool 15-year-old.
No mentions for New Kids on the Block. That is a surprise. No.
Well, all the girls at school were very much into them, but no.
Okay, so I'm going to mention a few there. I think Groovy Train was mentioned. I'm a big fan. I was a big fan of The Farm then. I still am. In Excess, of course. The Soup Dragons at number 24 with I'm Free. Brilliant song. There's one that nobody mentioned, London Beats at number 27, which is a great song. Possibly even a one-hit wonder. I've been thinking about you, I think it's called. That's a good song. And sorry, Michael, I'm with the others here. I'm a big fan of D-Light. I think it was a great song. I'm definitely putting that on my playlist. So you're gonna have to fast forward that, I think, during the re-recording of this when we put it down on that C. 60 tape. So, gentlemen, I'm going to move us on to film now. Let's have a look at what we've got here. So what have we got? We've got the movies from 1993, which of course was the final throes of the Graham Taylor campaign. So this would have been around the time of the San Marino game or the Netherlands game. I think the San Marino game. Aidan, I'm going to start with you, if I may. Any particular films that capture you in this list?
Well, 93. So now I'm at uni and had a lot of time on my hands, as any student does. So I think over the summer prior to this and then during this time, I've seen plenty of these. So Demolition Man seems to be at the top. I saw that, didn't rate it. But we got The Fugitive not far below that. That was an excellent film. Loved that one. Jurassic Park still hanging around. Obviously, that was more the summertime, I think, really, when that had been such a huge thing. But a bit further down, one I really, really like is True Romance. We've had a bit of the Tarantino thing with Reservoir Dogs by this point, and I know he didn't direct this one, isn't quite one of his, but he had a hand in it, and it was just part of that sort of coolness that was getting brought to that particular genre of cinema, I think. I don't even know what genre you would call it, but there was definite element of cool about anything that had Tarantino's hand on it at this point, and he would go on to Pulp Fiction the following year, which was superb. But this True Romance, I very much enjoyed that movie. So yeah, that's probably my favourite from the list, but Fugitive was another excellent one.
I was going to call you an old romantic then, and I actually looked what that film was about, so probably not.
Yeah, no, it's not that.
Michael, I shall be with you soon. Joe, what are you making us watch down the G-Plex, the local King's Cinema in West Bromwich? What are we watching?
Jurassic Park, I think I'd watch after them. I remember seeing that at the pictures, and it's the first time I'd been in the pictures for ages. And it was good, and also a tribute to the great Sam Neill we recently lost.
Short and sweet, and absolutely apt. What a brilliant actor he was. Michael, we're heading over to you now. What are you buying? Which film are you bringing the popcorn for?
Well, a bit predictable, Jurassic Park being the obvious one there, because I think we all saw that in 93, didn't we? Fugitive as well, like Aidan said. Really, really good film. Never actually watched True Romance, but I'm going to have to go and find that one off the back of what Aidan just said. Wasn't realised that was a Tarantino. That's probably
he wrote elements of it, Mike. I think I'm maybe giving him too much credit, but he had a hand in the writing.
No, okay. Well, if he's got anything to do, I know it's going to be a bit dark and a bit, yeah. So that sounds my type of thing. Other than that, no. I think some of these films I've watched since, as you do on Sky Movies, and they're just forgettable. I think, Sleepless in Seattle, I know is supposed to be a classic, but I don't really rate that at all. I think I've watched Hocus Pocus with my wife before, and that's forgettable as well. But yeah, I think it's probably Jurassic Park and The Fugitive for me.
And I think that's fair enough. I really do. I have to say, when I sent this list out, I regretted it almost straight away because I thought there was absolutely nothing here that I wished to watch. The Fugitive I saw and I enjoyed it, and I'll whisper it quietly, I did have a bit of a crush on Meg Ryan back in the day. Not so much these days, but anyway, that was 1993. Things were different. I was different. She was different. Gentlemen, thank you to that. Aidan, I'm going to hand back to you to wrap up this fantasy world.
Well, we've got to share the hosting things there, Chris. Throw it to you unexpectedly. Keep everyone on their toes. That's what we like to do. Well, there we go. Yeah, Graham Taylor's regime. Well, quite the time of it, I think it's fairly safe to say. But I think what we've shown is it's too easy to just dismiss it as a bad spell of England. There's always so many aspects to it. There's so many things. There's good people getting in situations that they can't cope with, making mistakes, and ignoring all the quality Geordie players at their disposal. So really what I'm saying there is he had it coming. But yeah, let's wrap things up there. We are not off to the USA in 1994. We are not going to the World Cup. We will have to watch that as pure neutrals from afar, enjoying it without any of the stresses of worrying about who England may get next and who they're going to pick in their four-person midfield and who on earth is going to play wide on the left. None of those problems at all for the English in the summer of 1994. We can all pretend to be fans of Jack Charlton's Ireland and Roy Hodgson's Switzerland. Thank you very much, everybody. Cheers, Michael, for your contributions this evening. Much appreciated.
No, absolute pleasure. I've loved that chat. It's been great fun.
And cheers, Joe. You've been a driving force behind several of these in this run of England's spell. So I'll leave you to pick on where we go next.
Thank you. Yeah, we should do another one. We'll have a conversation after.
There you go. Spot on. And cheers, Chris. You've been the driving force behind this particular episode, certainly. So thanks very much.
I'm off to have a arm wrestle with Rob Shepherd right now. So
as long as he smiles, that's all Graham wanted. He just wanted a smile, didn't he?
That's all I want to see, Rob. I want to see you smiling, Rob.
Oh, everybody needs to go and watch the documentary. We need to link. It is available on YouTube. So for those who are listening in who are a bit younger than the four of us, we will put a link, I guess, alongside what we post out, and do go and watch. It is stunningly good stuff, whilst utterly cringeworthy. I'll end on this comment, just saying to your colleague, the referee's got me the sack. Thank him ever so much, won't you? Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you again next time. Bye.